All right. So honestly, it's been a really busy week for me. My
Okay.
work, we're going through end of the year stuff. And I believe you reached out and you wanted to talk about economic growth. I believe as it relates to welfare policy. That could be totally wrong, but give me the rundown.
Um, so yeah, I want to talk about economic growth in the context of firstly how to achieve it, or how economists either measure it, or what steps can be taken to encourage economic growth, and then the connection of economic growth on poverty reduction, not specifically welfare, but poverty reduction, and also how innovation can affect economic growth and standard of living.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that that sounds like a good framework. So what context brought you to me, right? In this topic as well.
Well, it's funny. I do also debate socialists and communists often, or at least I used to a bit earlier on. And I typically am the one that knows economics the most. It's not something I studied as much as you have, but it was just nice to see like a person who knew what they were talking about, who studied the topic, debate other people, and I thought maybe I can pick your brain a little.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Let's do it.
Cool. So could you so I realize you again, you said you had a busy week, so let's keep it nice and light for our discussion. But economic growth, from apart from GDP, obviously, or maybe we can talk about what GDP calculates. But how do economists, proper economists, not myself, measure economic growth, and perhaps what can the government do to encourage it?
Yeah, sure. Well, typically, I mean, GDP is the classic measure. It's just the final price of goods with different components. The components of GDP is consumption, government spending, financial investment, and then net exports. Um, and that's typically how it's measured. It's a decent enough measure, just kind of what your economy is producing and the price that your economy can command for those things. Um, and in terms of how to encourage economic growth, there's a lot of ways. It really depends on the country, and it really depends on the time that we're talking about. But generally, the big things, like if we're talking highest level possible, starting from zero. And by starting from zero, I mean like uh, if your economy is not experiencing a lot of growth, if you're a relatively poor country, um, a couple big things would be that you need to have a military that is either stable in terms of how they run the country, or you need to have a military that listens to civilian rule, right? If you've got situations like in Latin America where basically the military is overthrowing the government and they're not exactly particularly stable or investor friendly, then you're going to have a volatile situation. More fundamentally than that, really, um, you're going to have stability no matter what you do, right? So, what I mean by that is if your country doesn't have stable institutions, if you're constantly embroiled in conflict and civil unrest and things like that, you're not going to be able to attract investment or spur any sort of development a lot of the times because people aren't going to want to build and grow businesses within your country because uh, there's no sort of understood civil
It's
society and
risky.
social construct. Yeah, I mean, because in places like America, you take for granted a lot of things, right? And whereas in a lot of countries, they don't have like the standard social contract and sort of um, civil service that exists, and so that kind of stuff is really important from like a really high level.
So political stability, rule of law, political institutions that resolve conflicts and uh, keep everything orderly. What else?
Beyond that, I would say things like investor rights are probably relatively important. Government services and programs play a big role too, don't get me wrong. So, like the government being able to provide select services is a good thing. So, the private market isn't going to do certain things. So, it's important that the state does them, or at least the private market's not going to do them as well. So, things like providing an education, maybe delivering the mail, depending on the country, issuing a stable and secured currency. Um, all of these things are important functions of the state at a bare minimum level. Obviously, providing police and fire service, stuff like that. If you don't have holistically all of these things, you end up with kind of a toxic business environment. You mentioned rule of law is a good word for it in general, and that's important to protect the customers as well as the investors. So that stuff's a pretty big deal. And other than that, I think it's important for, especially for developing countries, to create frameworks where they can build wealth and capture wealth in such a way that allows them to be outward facing either immediately or eventually, and uh, build sort of that economic base from the ground up as best as possible.
Okay, so for already developed countries that have those institutions and have the rule of law, and let's say America or any country in Europe, and let's say the year prior the growth was zero or minus 0.2, and this year full steam ahead. We really want economic growth. What do we do?
Sure. It really depends. So, um, it depends on the appetite for the type of growth and what type of growth you're really looking for. So, um, for
Give me
instance,
some
we could,
options.
yeah. So, what I was going to mention was, you could probably grow the economy to some degree by cutting a bunch of regulations and getting rid of a bunch of regulatory bodies, right? So, if we were to say, not have an FDA or not have any building standards, you might see some short term, yearly economic growth because all of a sudden there's basically a lot more money to be made in a much easier way. Um, but those kind of things would probably be short term, and it would probably result in the market not functioning as well as it could long term. If we're talking about how could we sustainably grow the economy in a way that doesn't sort of sacrifice the regulations that we rely on to sort of have a capitalist functional market system, uh, which I'm in favor of, is you'd want to look at uh, the tax code for the most part. Could we cut taxes on lower and middle income people? Could we simplify a bureaucracy here and there that could sort dollars more efficiently than the government could? Stuff like that, I think, would be reasonable policy to look towards. Could we provide tax credits or incentives for entrepreneurship or innovation that we're not providing now? Um, Stuff like that.
Okay. Um, so two points from what you said. I mean, I think I know what you may say, but I'll ask anyway. Why do you think there's like a conflict between regulations and economic growth on the one hand? And the second question is, in your opinion, what role do entrepreneurs play in this equation of economic growth?
Yeah. So it when you look at what economic growth is, right, the final price of goods and services, and necessarily the quantity of those goods and services, we can imagine a world where if we didn't have any sort of standards for food production, we can imagine a world where there'd probably be more of it because regulations are ultimately a barrier to entry, right? That if a market is heavily regulated, I'm not saying food is, to be fair, it is kind of, but if a market is heavily regulated, then it's going to be harder for uh, basically people to enter that market with any sort of an expertise because now instead of say growing apples, for instance, say you're the best apple grower, west of the Mississippi or something. Well, you're now entering into the market another axis that this person has to be abreast of, the regulatory environment of growing apples, right? So if you find yourself in a system where a market is overregulated to the point of inefficiency, you're driving up the cost of doing business in the form of compliance and regulatory standards that aren't necessarily material, but really they are, especially if you want to be competitive at scale. It just depends on the market, though. Um, that doesn't mean we shouldn't regulate things like food or medicine or housing, building standards. Um, it rather just means that it's important to recognize that these things do come at a cost. It's just a matter of reconciling uh, is the cost of that regulation worth it in terms of long term outcomes? A lot of regulations make markets function better than they would otherwise. Uh, and or regulations can lead to a more socially optimal outcome than than we would expect or experience without them. And so you just have to measure that sort of socially optimal outcome. Does it provide a socially optimal outcome, or does it make the market actually function better? And if these answers contradict each other, how do we reconcile that? And if they don't, obviously you've just got a kind of a win-win-win of a regulation. So just keeping that awareness of regulations and their effects on the market are important.
Okay, and I mean, I have an opinion that there are market forces that can regulate itself in a sense, or like a standards body, or consumer group, or things of that nature. But with regards to entrepreneurs, obviously regulation will also help reduce the upfront costs, or learning curve, or include more entrepreneurs or encourage them to come into the market. But apart from regulations, you mentioned tax credits or something along those lines?
Yeah, if your focus is sort of narrowly economic growth,
Yes.
then things that would put more money into lower and middle income people's hands would tend to result in more economic growth. And
Why is
so
that?
because the money circulates better, at least it tends to, right? So when you give a money to a really low income person, say someone who's just living paycheck to paycheck, whatever that means, depending on where they live, and you give that person an extra $2,000, right, in the form of either a direct payment or a tax credit or, a cut in their payroll tax or something like that. Um, they're gonna take that 2 grand and spend it on whatever they want. To be fair, but whatever they want is contributing to, in a macro scale, the economic growth of society, right? That basically you're shifting demand to the right because people have a boost in their income. And the second part of that equation, the income actually circulates and matriculates up and out throughout the economy.
I see. I'm focusing a bit differently on the question. I'm not necessarily worried about demand or people having money to buy more stuff. I'm worried more about production. Uh, People setting up entrepreneurs setting up new
Yeah.
companies,
Ah, I see. So you're
producing more things,
asking
jobs. Yeah.
what could the government do or refrain from doing to encourage entrepreneurship and innovation?
Assuming that this leads to economic growth, yes.
I see, I see. So
But by the way, is it actually preferable to have economic growth at some cost, or is there like a cutoff point where say, well, beyond this, it's not really worth it?
well, it's a good question. I think it's probably always good to have some level of economic growth, at least in today's society. There's people who are, quote unquote, degrowthers who think that mostly in environmental policy, the idea that it's not sustainable to have perpetual economic growth. But um, I'm not really on that side. I don't think, especially given the standards of living of broader society are not. I don't think to a standard that we would really be happy with. I don't think. In terms of
I'm familiar with that movement. Yeah, it's a bit strange.
yeah, I mean, as long as there's people in poverty, we've probably not grown quite enough and equitably enough. But that's obviously a different thought. But in terms of what the government could do to encourage entrepreneurship, tax policy probably matters to a certain extent. Like in the video I made about corporate taxes, I advocate the idea that um, smaller businesses probably shouldn't pay corporate taxes. That doesn't seem to make sense to me. Basically, if you're a larger business, I think there's some rationale for having corporate taxes, but if you're getting off the ground as a small business, I think there's probably some argument that you should be able to retain more of your cash if you want, and do what you want with it. That's one thing. Another thing would probably be funding government research. Probably plays a relatively pivotal role. The government can provide research that the market doesn't necessarily have the motivation to do, but can help the broader market. So, for instance, um, the government tends to be better at investing in long-term projects that don't necessarily immediately give a return. And so, with that in mind, we can imagine the types of research that the government can engage in that would be helpful uh, in general, right? So people talk about like the mRNA technology, where the government, I believe the government originally funded the research that uh, prototyped mRNA technology, but once the government developed that, they didn't make any drugs out of it. They just came up with the technology, and then the private market took that and developed the COVID vaccine, right? That's an example of efficient government research that can help out the broader market um, in general. A theoretical example could be if the government were to invest a ton of money into like fission nuclear power. Well, fission nuclear power would be able to provide an incredibly cheap baseload electricity that's also carbon free. Now, the private market isn't going to have the resources or the patience to invest hundreds of billions of dollars over the course of 20 to 40 years to develop technology like that, but it would actually help out the rest of society, and it would also help people build disposable income and make investments. So, stuff like that, I think the government can do to encourage entrepreneurship and make it happen.
So I have a little bit of a, I don't know, inner crisis at the moment. I kind of disagree with your opinion here, and I have some things to say about it, but because I'm not in that kind of, I'm discussing things. I'm asking your opinion on things. I'm not sure if I should mention it, but I do. I'm aware that government funds fund certain things. I believe it's more of a pray and spray approach to some things. So, for example, in my industry, the fact that the government funded DARPA, DARPA funded like the building blocks of the internet, then it necessarily is the case that everything that we see online, Google, Facebook, Twitter, the government, without the government, they would never have happened. Or at least that's the argument from the book, The Entrepreneurial State. And I'm not entirely sure I'm fully on board with that, but
Well, who knows
I
if it
don't
would
think
have happened? Well, I was gonna add in. Who knows if it would have happened eventually? It's just a matter of the speed at which it happens. And the government can uh, sometimes extend valuable investment towards the market or towards people that the market left to its own devices might take a long time to do. For instance, a simple example of this would be the city of Chattanooga, Tennessee. They had gigabit internet in 2010, basically a decade before anyone else did, right? And that's just because, the government, that's local city government, had the ability and the push to regulate the internet as a public utility and provide what was ultimately a better service for a cheaper price towards its citizens, right? Because the government was able to build the infrastructure a bit more efficiently and quickly than the market could at the time, right? So it's not a matter of the government doing everything or doing all, the foundations of modern technological advancement is always based on government research. It's really just to say that there's a place for government in that equation, and that it's not a place that could necessarily be filled by a purely private um, system.
Um, so I don't want to dwell on this point for too long. I would say and I think I'm not sure if this statistic is from you or from someone else, but the government in terms of
Okay,
all research, the government funds I think 25% and 75% is the market. I believe. I'll have to check. I just remember the number from
that
something I
sounds
saw.
right.
Um, with regards to the gigabit Ethernet to a local town, I'm familiar with the story, and I'm familiar with that Americans have this monopoly between the different internet providers, or there's no two internet providers in one place in the US. I'm not sure why exactly. But yeah, I
Well,
mean, even
it's
when I was
it's
in
yeah, it's because the market, it fails, in that regard, right? That it's it's not it's more profitable for these, you know, oligarchic, essentially oligopoly type system, um, to have sort of districted monopolies, especially in rural areas. This is a good example that happened recently. You heard about probably the Biden infrastructure plan that included
Mm.
tens of billions of dollars to extend broadband internet access to rural communities, because it's just not profitable for businesses to go and build internet lines and compete in rural areas, especially against the local ISP that already basically has like an 80-90% market share. This is just another example where the government coming in could um, basically extend more equitable and affordable access to something that's pretty cool, the internet, right?
so I mean, in the UK, in the north of the country, we also have an issue where some farmers or some smaller communities do not have access to fiber internet. They'll have. I'm not sure if that's still the case. I think there's been a push to get them on board,
Yeah.
but there was, I don't know, maybe like 8 years ago, complaints that people are still using modems and stuff like that over regular phone lines. Um, but in your example of a town saying, "Look, we're going to band together. We're going to put like a fiber line underneath the ground or a cable on top of something, and we're going to get gigabit Ethernet to the town, and then we're going to distribute it equally through some kind of Wi-Fi system." I mean, those things were available when I was in high school, and I believe South Korea started them before anyone else did. I don't know. I can't speak to what's happening in the US with regards to why is it exactly the case that there's no two competing internet providers in the same area. I'm not sure if it is to do with regulations or it's to do with an agreement between the two companies. I can't speak to it. But going back to the innovation, Peter Peter Thiel is very concerned about the innovation. I've seen a few of his talks about why don't we have more of it. And he says that if a government gets into a particular industry and starts funding research on it, then it slows down. It doesn't develop as quickly. And I'm not exactly sure. He mentioned an example where let's say chemical engineering. If government starts to invest
Yeah.
in research grants and stuff like that, then it kind of has an effect on how much money a chemical engineer can get on in maximum capacity. Like how what is the salary? And if a government comes in and because it for whatever reason of either bureaucracy or it's tied to someone approving something, then the wages in that industry will be low. Whereas Silicon Valley and internet startups, they never had a cap on how much people can earn. And people right out of university, they try to get in there. Or let's say there was a move away from finance, or people going straight into finance. They started funneling into Silicon Valley, which means talented people funneled into that industry. Um, what do you think?
Yeah. I would say, give me 1 second.
Sorry, I'm not. I didn't actually mean to do this.
No,
I
you're good. You're
apologize.
good.
I just say
Sorry, I
that
had to.
innovation is just near and dear to my heart. Is
No,
why
you're
I'm
good. You're good.
overly excited about it.
I had to tell. I had to answer a question someone asked. So yeah, I mean, I kind of disagree. It kind of goes against the fundamentals of what you'd imagine how a market would function, right? So, um, I don't really think I don't think the government is sort of pushing people's wages lower in that research really causes the market to lack access in general. I think really if a technology or an innovation storyboarded out were to be profitable and marketable, the two most obviously the two most important things when it comes to any sort of a research, then companies would still be incentivized to pay more than the government, get labor over, and research that product. It's just that there are certain things that take so many years in terms of research, or um, they're not necessarily as immediately marketable, um, that it's not a good incentive to do research privately. Um, Most research, at least in America, is done privately, but that doesn't mean that the core component of research, that 25%, 30%, however much it is, that's government research, isn't really crucial to the market.
Let me ask a question on this point, and I'll give an example. So the company BioNTech, the one that sold the vaccine to Pfizer, who then just what did they do? They tested it and went through the process with the FDA. But the BioNTech, they developed the actual thing, the mRNA thing. They spent, I believe, 10 years funding research in that particular area. So, if I'm not mistaken, these were Turkish immigrants that immigrated to Germany, husband and wife team. They had a previous company that also did some research for 7 odd years, and this research means that they're paying salaries to all the researchers while not seeing any money yet. They succeeded in something, I forget what. They got paid a lot of money, so they opened this new BioNTech, and they put money in there to start research in a bit of a different area. And even now, the money that they made from this vaccine, they wanted to use the same mRNA to fight a specific two specific types of cancer. They got 1.5 billion. So they're putting all that money in research. So I mean, 7 to 10 years in the area, at the very least, of biotech, that's not unheard of. And people go into that sector understanding that that's what it's going to cost, and they still commit to that. They just need, financial capital. It doesn't always work, but 1 in 10
Yeah.
or something like
Well,
something like those odds.
yeah, I'm looking at it here though. It says that in terms of BioNTech, they've had hundreds of millions of dollars of
Mhm.
money that's been granted or loaned to them by the government, right?
The
So
German government?
it seems to indicate various governments. I guess BioNTech is like I mean, similar to most people, I have not heard of this company before COVID, obviously, but it seems that many government and government institutions have worked with this company in order to grant them money or loans in for various sort of forms of develop or sorry, I'm sorry, for various forms of research. And so that's that
And
doesn't
look,
seem
I'm not. I mean, I don't think that's necessarily bad. You're in
right.
this sort of mixed economy environment, and you're trying to get your company up and running. So if you can
Yeah.
get grants or loans, you make that effort.
Yeah, no, of course not. That's all I'm saying is that, well, the type of money and resource that governments are able to move uh, is a lot grander oftentimes than the private market. The government just has a lot more power to move resources than any one company. And so for the government to come in and do their own research, and then in situations like this, of course, provide grants and loans and financing to private entities to do similar research. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. It's really just a matter of uh, explaining and understanding that um, the government plays an important role in um, enabling select forms of innovation in the economy, right? Um,
It,
and
it's
you
it's
know we're
difficult.
we're better for it.
It's difficult to say. It's just it's. I'm not. I'm not sold on the idea just because they spread money around that they're solely responsible for it. I mean,
No, I didn't.
okay,
Well,
they
hold.
did spread money around.
Well, I didn't say that, to be fair, right? So the government isn't solely responsible for entrepreneurship and innovations and stuff. Like the government didn't, as far as I'm aware, didn't create Netflix, right? Or didn't. I think that Google actually did originally get some money from the government, so maybe that's not a good example to steel man your point. But I mean, the point is though that the government's not responsible for all innovation that happens. It's just a matter of the government plays an important role in some amount of the core level of innovation in our society, right? And recognizing, you know, failing to recognize the important role of government in the sort of spark of innovation in an economy is just as ignorant or obtuse as when people try to say what you said at the beginning, which is, oh, things like the internet would just have never existed without the government. The truth is, there's a ebb and flow and a push and pull with these kind of things, and a relationship between the government and the market that needs to exist in regards to innovation. Um, and that can be very effective. That's all.
I remember, this is a true story. I was working in a company that had some somewhat artificial intelligence. Not really, but a little bit. Like it was in the name, but not like super artificial intelligence. And they were approached by the government, and the government said they want to spend a billion pounds propping up the artificial intelligence sector in the UK. They never asked for money, but they were kind of like a pro. I don't know if this is like anecdotal, but can I just ask one thing, and I am keen on this answer. When did the government get involved in investing in research in the US? What year roughly? Because I'm assuming that prior to that, it was from the market, from the innovation came from the market.
Yeah, it's a good question. To be honest, I'm not sure there's ever been a time when the government didn't do its own, didn't invest in R&D. I mean, I'm sure there's probably examples even back in like the 80s and 90s or something, um, of the government investing in some amount of research. So I'm not sure honestly the answer to that question, because the truth is I'm not sure if I don't know if there is an answer. I mean, even back in medieval Europe or something, governments invested in innovation and research. It may have not been focused in types of areas we see today, but certainly, there's probably always been some amount of R&D that governments have engaged in.
I saw a lecture once about intellectual property rights in the US and how it was early on. I don't want to seem stupid, but it was early on in the Constitution, or it was early on implied from the Constitution, but cleared up in the Federalist, in two Federalist papers. And the point that the person was making in the lecture was that these intellectual property rights really helped America innovate. So in 1780 or 1790, most of America was largely agrarian, and then 100 years later, they were already industrializing quite fast. I believe, I believe there was the. So this could be something that I may seem a bit silly if I don't get right, but the telegraph was invented. Some kind of submarine was invented by the time there was the Civil War. Also, all sorts of things to do with grinding wheat. Some kind of patents. There was electricity. No, electricity was in England. I'm not sure. But yeah.
I'm not sure. I don't know. I think Thomas Edison was. I thought he was an American. Maybe that's just being ignorant on my part.
I think, but the what British? I'm not sure. I'll have to check.
Well,
Anyway,
yeah,
but
I'm
but
no idea.
but the point he was making, and I found interesting that the more that prior in the UK, when you would get a patent on something, it was basically a monopoly from the crown that says you are the one that can sell this technology, which means that you as the inventor would have to actually sell something with your invention. Whereas in the US, you could say, well, I'm the inventor and I want to specialize in inventing. I have intellectual property rights, and if a businessman wants to hook up with me and they handle the business side and pay me a license fee, then that's fine, and I'll keep specializing in what I do, and they specialize in what they do.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, let's move on. So, with regards to economic growth, what is the connection between economic growth and poverty reduction in your opinion, or how do you measure that, or what would you look at to see if that's actually happening, or is it distributed unevenly, the economic growth?
Yeah, you can look at the inequality of society with the Gini coefficient. Just how what's the relative amount of income and how it's how it's distributed. You can do
No,
the
I
same thing
mean,
with wealth.
not
Yeah, sure.
distributed necessarily, but like, is it targeting the people in poverty? Is it alleviating specifically the poorer end of the spectrum? Uh, is there in fact a connection between economic growth and alleviation between the poorer end of the spectrum, or is it economic growth and they don't feel it whatsoever? Or how
No,
would you
yeah,
measure that?
yeah. No, that's exactly what I'm saying. Is that you can look at how unequal a society is, and you can kind of from there try to determine, well, if we're getting a lot of economic growth and society is still relatively unequal, there's probably some structure of the economy that's causing this to happen, right? That should probably be alleviated, right? Economic growth is a good thing, but it's important that the structures of the economy exist to such an extent that that growth is within reason equitably distributed, right? You don't want to just a bunch of oligarchs to become richer on the back of their slave labor, right? GDP might go up, but that doesn't really comment on the broader sort of societal level of material wealth, right? And so um, that those are some metrics to look into that are important. That if you see economic growth happening, but you don't see like average incomes going up, right? There's probably there's probably some issues there that are deserving of some that need to be rectified, I would imagine.
Okay, is there a measure for standard of living? So, for example, and this is like a particular angle to help the poor. So, if GDP, if economic growth, if the economy grows and GDP rises, and let's say as a result, we produce more of some things, and the price of those things go down. Meaning, in in this situation, the wages have not gone up, but the purchasing power has gone up, and especially for the poor. Is that something you would look at, or would you look at, or is the Gini coefficient more of a symbolic stat for looking at something like that?
Hey, you can look at consumption expenditures. So like what that's probably a better way of determining what I would call material wealth.
Okay.
And go from there. A lot of times, sometimes governments will provide that statistic based on percentiles. So, the bottom 10%, what's their
Mm-hmm.
consumption
Yeah.
expenditure, stuff like that. Um, there's also a human development index, which
Mm-hmm.
I think is by country. I don't know if it's more granular than that, that tries to determine, well, not necessarily just the economic growth, but like things like incomes, access to electricity, education, running water, stuff like that, where the uh, you know it's not always the case that GDP is always the best metric. So stuff like that can help answer those types of questions.
Okay. Can I just ask if you know offhand the bottom 10% or the bottom quintile in the US, in your opinion, how would you say they're doing currently?
The bottom 10%.
The bottom quintile, the poorest of the poor. Just roughly.
So oh, here we go. This is what I was looking. Okay. Sorry, I needed to look at the numbers.
That's fine.
Yeah,
I was
so
interested to know,
we're
to be honest.
Yeah, so we're talking about people who have less than basically $25,000 a year in income. And
Okay.
yeah, I would say those people are definitely struggling. I mean, living on less than 25 grand a year in America is pretty much never going to be comfortable, almost no matter where you live. Sure, there's some places, but, you know, um, the trouble is that some places have really low cost of living, but that doesn't mean that there's
Hmm.
jobs there, right? So, um, you have to balance like where are the jobs and how expensive is it to live there. And so, yeah, I would say pretty much anyone living under 25 grand a year is probably living pretty tight.
Is just, sorry. Do those figures include people who are on their pension and are no longer working, or people who are students or teenagers, or is that not really what's counted into that figure?
It's a good question. I'm not. I believe it should include. This is household income.
Okay.
So
Oh, really?
so if I believe it should include things like your capital gains income or your pension wealth, stuff like that. And
Okay.
obviously, if you're a student, you're within typically a household, so that you're going to be included in there as well. So, um, yeah, I mean, it should include those kinds of things.
Okay. No, that's I just wanted to know. I'll move on to the next topic, and can I please put you a little bit on the spot, because I've seen your debates and there's something that frustrates me, and I wanna comment if that's okay with you.
Yeah, yeah, go for it.
So I've seen you debate Vosh and Demon Mama, and it seems to me like you're coming in with all these nice, accurate. Not I'm not debating, accurate details, and they're like very much focused on the morality of the situation. Like you can say, well, I've got these studies that say that people in the Nordic countries are happier, and so on and so forth. This is better here, and they're like, well, they're being exploited by the capitalist. I don't care. What we need is for them to not be exploited. Did you ever get that feeling?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's sort of what underpins a lot of the socialist response to systems of capitalism that have worked quite well in terms of delivering people happiness and developed, you know, high wealth basically. Because socialists have kind of a problem, I think, when contending with Nordic countries because these people are very happy and they're not perfect societies or utopias by any means, but it seems like the experiments of Nordic um, welfare capitalism has worked out a lot better than most socialist experiments. And so oftentimes the reliance is less on empirics and data and more so based on um, much more esoteric kind of things like theories of exploitation either at home or abroad and stuff like that, which I think can be, you know, not necessarily hand waved, but uh, I was perfectly willing to have a more theoretical conversation with Demon Mama and with Vosh a more empirical conversation where he was challenging more the empirics. Demon Mama challenged more the theoretical stuff. So pretty interesting conversations all around.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the Coconut Island thing very
Oh
much.
yes, yes, Coconut Island, a classic
Classic, yeah.
rebuttal to the idea of having to work.
The thing is, I feel I, that what is missing is like a sort of ethics because I don't think that the points you made is I don't think it's esoteric or emotional to them. I think it's a matter of philosophy. They have one. It's a matter of ethics, and I think that to counter their ethics, in a sense, you have to have one of your own, or you have to have that capitalism has an ethic behind it. As you can then say, for example, um, it
Yeah,
gives you the freedom to pursue your own happiness, and that is ethical. Um, uh, you reduce violence in society because people now start to trade instead of, I don't know, steal from one another. And you mentioned the government and rule of law, so all these things kind of reduce violence from society, or at least that's kind of the idea. And this sort of freedom and the reduction of violence accelerates transactions in an economy. So people can, I don't know, get richer faster or form cooperate with other people easier. They don't have to worry about being cheated as much or something like that. But I think that would be helpful if you attack the morality of the situation with your own morality. So if for example they're saying, well, someone's being exploited, obviously it's immoral. If Vosh is saying Norway is only as rich as it is because other countries are countries that it once colonized. I'm not sure if that was the argument. Countries that it once colonized are suffering now, so there's an exchange of resources. And what do you think? Sorry about. I'm just rambling at this stage.
yeah, no, I mean that's perfectly reasonable. I mean, I think again, I tried to do that during the Demon Mama conversation just to say that, look, um, I don't think it's immoral to have to work. Really, I think it's just a standard of sort of the human condition. I obviously I talked to Destiny about it in a follow up conversation, which was just the idea that we theoretically, yeah, it'd be great if no one had to work, right? I mean, nobody would
Well,
intellectually disagree with the idea that if you don't want to work at a job, you don't have to. It's just a matter of necessity and the types of frameworks that, what kind of frameworks can you put in place to um as equitably and fairly institute a system where you recognize that, you know, you're going to have to work most of the times, right? And so um that's kind of the logic of the Demon Mom conversation that I thought, went well enough.
no, I'm not. Obviously, it's obviously went well. I remember commenting on your Discord that I had moments of cringe, like it was attacks of cringe. But I would say this. So obviously you're right in this example you've given. Obviously you're right. Everyone has to work. If there was no capitalism or no cities or something, you would still have to work in nature. Like you have to feed yourself. You have to make sure you have a roof over your head. You have to find water. These are not things you can avoid. And socialists tend to blame capitalism in a sense because, well, capitalism should have achieved abundance, And in the Jean-Jacques Rousseau kind of mentality, nature is abundant already, and capitalism kind of put people in a situation where they've kept the abundance away from them on purpose because they needed slaves to work for them, or what's in quotations. But I think what I would say is that to counter it, that I wouldn't actually go down that path. It depends how angry I am, but I wouldn't actually go down that path. I would have said something like, first of all, Karl Marx said that working is the essence of man. So people attach meaning and purpose to the life from working. Now, ideally, it should be something that they enjoy doing, or they feel that they're contributing value to society in, instead of being forced to take a particular situation. But what we can do in like a free market system or capitalist system is give them more and more options to choose the best one for them. So they have more of a choice to determine themselves which is the best choice for them. If it's the one that makes the most money in the finance sector, that could be one. If it's like middle of the road teacher in university because they really care about teaching and they think it gives them a great purpose in life, we should allow them to do that. It's not something we want to get away with. People find a lot of meaning in the life from working, but it's just a point to make. What do you think? Sorry.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's something I get at with um I think I've spoken to Hans a couple times on his stream, and I think that's one thing I mentioned is that um you know, just because, how do I put this? Like, just because someone works at what you might think is a crappy job doesn't mean that they are unhappy with it. It just depends on the job, it depends on the person. And so instituting um tools and policies and regulations and sort of tax structures that exist so that uh people are as satisfied as possible with where they work, they have as many options as feasibly possible to give them in terms of where to work, and they have the resources required to prepare them for the type of work that they want to do, education and training and stuff like that. Um,
Mhm.
to me, I don't really have a problem with that. I mean, it's just I think it's the job. I think what's a tougher burden for socialists is to, say we have just a great society, right? Everyone gets a UBI equal to a material living. Say that there's 80-90% unionization. There's worker board membership. There's cooperatives all around because of good government subsidies and stuff like that. Um, but there's obviously, because there's unions, because there's worker board membership, there's still some amount of private investment, private organization, and economy. Um, but also there's a UBI that everyone can rely on, or there's a negative income tax that you can fall back on, whatever. Um, Socialists have to explain, why is it immoral for a person in that society to work for another person in that society? Why is that wrong? Right? They've got all the resources available to them if they don't want to work. Functionally, they don't have to. Um, what's wrong with that relationship, right? And I'm just, to me,
Well,
you've
I'll tell you the answer if you'd like.
sure.
It is well, I can't really steelman this position, so it's a little bit tongue in cheek, but basically, I've read a lot of Marxist literature. Actually, we didn't get to Schumpeter as well, but I'll ask that in a second. And it's not that they don't. It's not that they necessarily. How can I explain? They're very much against bourgeoisie's owning private property. That's the main thing of attacking in socialism, and in communism, there's just the abolition of property rights in general. Um, so basically, any system that has rich people in it, that's bad. Why are they rich? Because they must have exploited the labor, the surplus value
Right.
from other people, and that's unacceptable.
No, and
Even
that,
if
yeah,
let me just end. Even if like, and I think you actually mentioned this, even if the entire society suffers, or like the Gini coefficient is a lot lower, but the GDP is a lot lower, that's still kind of better than the bourgeoisie's owning private property.
yeah, and my moral argument in that regard is that In a society where you've done everything I've just described, you've virtually eliminated the necessary coercion, in my view, of a capitalist framework. Um, and so it's reasonable for a laborer to sell their labor to a capitalist so that they have access to capital they wouldn't otherwise, and it's more of a trade of surplus rather than an extraction of surplus, where I'm taking surplus value of the capitalist's capital because I wouldn't have this capital otherwise. I might not have the capacity or the desire to fund that capital myself. um, and capitalist wouldn't have my labor, obviously. So you're trading surpluses rather than one extracting from another. I just that would be my view, and sort of my, you could say, moral argument, but really I don't really like moralizing economics, but socialists kind of
Yeah.
make you do
Yes.
it a
Yes.
lot of the times. So that would be my
So
argument, though.
so I would say this. I think that if you're operating in a gray area where there's some coercion, but it's okay because of this, then you're giving them like a hook to nibble on in a sense. So, for example, the idea of the coercion argument in and of itself is this: you have two parties, an employer and an employee, and both the employer wants to give a job, the employee wants a job, and they kind of like negotiate, they meet in the middle, and both people walk away from the exchange, from the voluntary exchange, happier and profiting in one way or another. If they didn't profit, they wouldn't proceed with the exchange. And the idea with kind of like why is it exploitative is because on a two-party exchange, you're only focusing on one party, so you have a very narrow view of what's happening in reality, and you focus on the employer, and you see the employer is making a profit, and that's your magnifying glass is only focused on them. And if they're making a profit, they must have made a profit at the expense of someone else. It can't be the case that someone else also made a profit. It just cannot be. And then they say, well, this is exploitation. If the employer made any money at all, then they're exploiting labor. And if they made zero, then they wouldn't be able to make any money. Therefore, capitalism is in and of itself coercive or exploitative. But if you zoom out a bit and you say, well, look, there's two parties here. It's not exploitative. They both agree to it. And again, if you want to give workers more options, then allow more employers to exist in the market. Therefore, their wages will rise as a result of competition. Or you can say, for example, if you want the employees to increase their wages, if they increase their skills, their experience, their talent, that would mean the employers are now competing for their scarce resources, their scarce skills, basically, or know-how. And you could recommend something like that if you feel that it is unequal in some way. But it is not exploitative if both sides voluntarily agree. At least, that's my minarchist position. But if you say, well, look, I understand that capitalism is a little bit coercive or a little bit exploitative, but I add, worker board unions, worker board things. So it's kind of okay. They'll kind of jump on it. So, well, it's still not 100% okay. It's still not moral.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I'm not sure if it's valuable to ignore the coercive elements. I mean, the truth is that um the relationship between an employee and an employer can certainly be coercive, right? And it's, that can happen in a market socialist system as well, right?
Yeah.
Um, it's just a matter of trying to eliminate the coercion that exists, right? And who you're being coerced by, right? So there's several frameworks for developing a labor economy, you could say, right? So the first is kind of a more capitalist mode of production like we have now. You got employees and employers on a private side for the most part. The second would be like a centrally planned system where basically the state's the employer. The third would be a market socialist system where you've got uh, how do I put this? Basically every employee is an owner, right? But it's a democratic structure. Uh, and and the fourth would be like a communal type system where you've got there's not like necessarily a concept of ownership, but it's still a sort of democratic framework, communally ran sort of thing. And the first side of capitalism as a labor market is you've got uh, a potential for employers being coercive to their employees, taking advantage of their bargaining power and their leveraging ability of those employees. That's one thing. So minimizing that's important. Obviously, under a central planning system, the coercive element comes from the state, perhaps the state telling you what to do, how to work, where to work, when to work, stuff like that. Under a market socialist system, obviously, you could be essentially at the will of your cooperative, right? That if it's a democratic framework, you might have a minority opinion that isn't represented in
Mhm.
that business's operations. And lastly, when it comes to the communal sort of communist type system, well, this is sort of a theoretical construct that I'm not sure holds up to itself because, in theory, oh, you could just leave the commune, right? Or you don't have to always listen to the anarchist sort of rules that we've set in place. And it's like, okay, well, there's always, I think, necessarily a coercive element involved when your response is, well, you can always just fucking leave, right? Um, and so every labor market and system of labor and organization of labor has the ability to be coercive, right? It's just a matter of how can we minimize that coercion and go from there.
What do you mean by what do you mean by coercive? Because coercive in like the more legal sense is like threat of force, but you mean like leverage, like a bit more leverage than the other person kind of coercive, or
Yeah, I'm not talking about. I don't mean threat of force. I mean essentially coercion as a what I would define it as is
unfair?
well, coercion I think exists when because of some power or leverage imbalance, you have the ability to get people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do, right? Um, or deal with conditions they wouldn't otherwise tolerate. And so that's how I would define coercion in the context of like a socialism and capitalism argument.
Okay, so if let's say I'm a highly skilled employee and and I have leverage over my employers because I'm just there's not that many of me, or I have a very niche skill. Am I coercing them?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I say as much. I made a video about my is capitalism coercive video where I talk about if you're like the only guy in the whole entire world that can say fix this certain thing, right? You could absolutely fuck over a bunch of employers who are contracting you to fix that thing. You're the only one that can do it, right? And so
Feels good.
yeah, yeah, exactly, right. And so it's possible. It just doesn't happen as often that the employee has like a relative power imbalance, right? So it depends on the
I don't
context.
I don't wanna toot my own horn, but I'm in a I'm in a very niche profession. There's only 23 of me in my country.
Yeah, exactly. If you've got like these, different certification standards or something or whatever, I think someone once told me that you can actually get paid very well if you code in archaic languages,
Yes,
like
yes, yes.
languages that are yeah, relatively outdated because like government systems might be like a government system may have been coded in the 1990s on some totally outdated language, but if you're the
People
guy that knows it, you can really extract some surplus of your own, I guess, right? from
de-
the from the
developers
government.
coming in holding the colostomy bag like on like a pole with like some wheels. Yeah, I'll fix your problem from the 60s, no problem. There's
Exactly,
actually
yeah. So stuff like that can exist, certainly.
there's actually something if I can add to your listeners, they may find it valuable. There are these really old database technologies in financial institutions, and they can never turn them off to upgrade them because it just costs too much money. So these are really, really old technologies, and if you know how to service them, you got a job for life basically because they're never gonna shut it off and upgrade it. That it will just never happen.
Yeah, exactly. Stuff like that. Yeah, no, you're right. But yeah, I would say that in a sense that's yeah, that is coercion as well, right? It's just who's taking advantage of who, right? So
Well, it's their decision to not replace it or do this. I mean, yeah, they'd rather not pay me or other people as much, but I mean, to some degree, like, if you're a very talented doctor or you studied, you're the top in your field in something, and I think that's something that a lot of socialists miss because the assumption is that everyone is unskilled labor or like the immiseration of the proletariat, or like you because of division of labor in like Adam Smith style, that you get paid less and less wages, just subsistence wages. And obviously it hasn't been the case. People go to university for a reason. Everyone tries to get these on the skilled work experience, or these I forgot what you guys call it, it's not a university, it's like a school for 1 or 2 years for a particular kind of
Trade
trade or
school.
some trade school, yeah.
Yeah.
And like everyone, and like when you work for a company like 10 years, you have 10 years experience working in that company, and that has some value. Uh, so these sorts of ways increase wages, more skill, more experience, a talent in a particular something. These things force the employers to pay you more, but they don't mind because you're super productive. So from their point of view, it's fine.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. No, that's totally right. All right. Well, did you have anything else? It's been an hour, but did you have anything else you wanted to talk about?
Um, I mean, I think we covered a lot. I have a topic that's a bit. I don't know if I should mention it because it may take a bit. Up to you. Would you like to discuss this slightly long? I don't know if it's long, but could be long topic.
Um, yeah. How about this? If you want, you can just message it to me, and we can maybe schedule another time.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, no. So really, thank you for your time, and I appreciate the conversation.
Definitely.
And
Yeah. It
yeah, I
was
thought it was interesting.
for sure. Yeah. It was fun talking to you. And obviously, thanks for being a part of the sort of community and participating. I see in the Discord a lot, so it's always nice to have people active and talking within the this sort of small niche community that we've created, I guess. So
My pleasure.
but all right, I'll talk to you later, bud. Bye.